Hello everyone, I'm Ross Tanner. I chair the Harkness Fellowship Trust Board in New Zealand. Welcome to this webinar. It's very good to have already a number of people joining us. I think I was told a minute ago that there's at least 20 people online. I see some of my fellow Trust Board members there, so welcome to you. And just to briefly introduce the Harkness Fellowships. For the last 50 years, really, the Harkness Fellowship program has existed in New Zealand, and it's enabled emerging New Zealand leaders in a number of fields of study or vocation to travel to the United States to research what other practitioners in the US have done or are doing in their particular field, to learn lessons and to explore how those lessons can be applied in New Zealand. More recently, we have focused mostly on public sector candidates. So the people you're going to hear from this afternoon have all, or at the time of their fellowship, were all working in public service departments or organisations in Wellington. Just to, if I can put a little advertisement in right at the outset, one of the exciting new developments for the Harkness Fellowships is that later this year we will be offering not just one fellowship for the 2020 or 2021 year, of course, if travel is possible by that point, but we plan to offer 3 or 4 fellowships, and at least 3 of those will be open for candidates in the not-for-profit sector. We'll be making some announcements about that in the next month or two. So I hope that you will keep an eye out and help us to promote the fellowships in New Zealand and identify people who might be worthwhile candidates, worthy candidates for the fellowship. So this afternoon, we're doing something completely different for the Harkness Fellowship Trust Board. As you'll see, we're having a webinar, a virtual report back session. We have in the past held report back sessions with people who we've sponsored to go to the United States. This time, we not only have 1, we have 3, and some very interesting work and exciting ideas that all of these 3 people have brought back. So we thought it was worthwhile holding a webinar to allow them to explain their ideas, explain what they did in the United States, and there'll be, as Peter Griffin has said, time for questions to follow at the end. The format is that I'm going to ask shortly each of the returning fellows to speak for about 20 minutes, one after the other without any questions, and we hope to have questions starting at around about 5 o'clock for about quarter of an hour, 20 minutes, with the aim of finishing this webinar at around about 20 past 5. So that's the format. Without further ado, I'd like to first introduce to you Joe Beaglehole, who is a senior analyst at the Ministry for the Environment. Joe spent 3 months in the United States, in New York, in fact, at New York University early last year. And his focus was on tools and institutions to better accommodate rapid urban growth. So I'm going to ask Joe now to speak to you. And as Peter said, please feel free to use the chat availability to ask or put down any questions you'd like to ask Joe later as his presentation progresses. There'll be some PowerPoint slides being put up on screen by each of the fellows as we go. So Joe, over to you.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Ross, and hello, everybody. So I'm very pleased to be here today, and it was a great privilege to spend 3 months in New York last year on a Harkness Fellowship. And I see a couple of people in the audience, Jonathan Boston and Roger Blakely, that helped me out with some ideas before I left and some contacts. So hello to them, and I'm looking forward to letting you know what I got up to while I was over there. So I did write a research paper while I was there, and I'm very happy to share that with you all. But I thought today I'd go for a broader range of experiences, because that might be a bit more interesting, cover a broader range of ground and give you some of the sort of debate and some of the big topics that are happening in New York, and glean from that a few insights rather than delve into some theory. So if I just click, oh, sorry, from the beginning. How about this? So as Ross mentioned, the main goal of my research was to gain insights for New Zealand's urban growth challenges. I was based for 3 months at the Merrill Institute at New York University, and that's got some of the more interesting thinkers in the world, actually, I think, thinking about urban issues. So one of them, Alain Berthaud, is a famous planner, worked for many years at the World Bank, and he's written a recent book about bringing together insights from urban economics into land use planning. So he talks about cities as labor markets and transportation networks, and thinks about how the regulation needs to respond to that. Solly Angel is a famous urban mapper, so he's got a new atlas where he's using satellite data to map all the cities in the world and sort of talk about how they're growing and changing. And Vicky Bean is actually a law professor, but is now the deputy mayor responsible for housing policy in New York. So she was, I ended up doing a land use regulation class with her, and she had some great insights into how New York City is changing from what might have been called a growth machine. You know, there was a perception that cities in the US were about growth and encouraging growth, but they're becoming more like suburbs, so sort of protectionist suburbs where change is a lockdown. So this is one of the things that she's written about. So, well, what did I do when I got over there? Well, the first thing I did was give a seminar on the various issues that you're all aware of in New Zealand, and that allowed me to connect with a lot of interesting people at the department and other organisations. Then I spent the next 3 months really meeting lots of different academics, officials at the housing department and the planning department, various NGOs like the Regional Plan Association and the Fair Housing Justice Centre, and startup companies working in urban related fields. Jonathan put me in touch with a great contact in Washington, DC, Daniel Fiorino, and I actually attended a conference organized by him about the future of environmental protection, the Environmental Protection Authority over there. So that was also relevant and interesting. I attended classes and hearings, and I also got involved in local planning processes. I think that's the best way to find out what's actually going on in some of these systems, is to dip in and out of some of the debates about a new development in a particular area. So I did that, and there happened to actually be a review of New York's land use planning processes going on while I was over there. So I also attended public hearings about that. And so what can I draw out of all this? So I'll give you a few highlights of the debate that was happening in New York City while I was there, and then run through a few insights. So the first of these is about land use regulation. So and the processes we use to create and change things like zones, which tell you where you can and can't build and so on. So as I arrived in New York, there was this amazing debate happening about the future of the Amazon headquarters. And Amazon had been running a competition across the United States to see which city was going to give them the biggest tax break to locate their new base in their area. And in return, they were promising 25,000 high-paying jobs. And the mayor of New York, Bill de Blasio, and the governor, Andrew Cuomo, had done a deal with Jeff Bezos to locate the new base in Long Island City. And then all of a sudden, there was a total outcry from the local residents, and protests, and a new very charismatic left-wing leader called Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez got behind the local residents, and in the end, Amazon was forced to back down and decide not to put their base in New York. So when I arrived in the city, everybody was talking about, well, what's actually happened here? And what had happened was that they hadn't paid attention to the local politics. They hadn't got buy-in from the local community, and as a result, the development hadn't gone ahead. And but it really did underscore that local control, local influence over land use is a major issue of interest and major powerful force in America. But before I go any further, I should just say a couple of things about land use planning in New York City. So it's famous for having invented zoning in 1916 as a way of managing the shading effects of the new skyscrapers that were going up. It's still operating on its 1961 zoning code. So that's an interesting thing. But although that code has now been changed so many times, it's become so complicated, nobody can understand it, I was told. Despite that, still 80% of development in New York occurs as of right. So the zoning code is still relatively enabling 50 years on. New York is a city of renters. 70% of people in New York City rent. So that changes the debate, and vast swaths of that are rent-controlled buildings. So that really changes the debate about whether or not development is going to be allowed in a neighborhood. And perhaps the biggest urban planning issue going on in New York, well, times have changed now because of COVID-19, but when I was there a year ago, pre-COVID, the biggest issue was probably something called, clumsily called gentrification, which is, the transformation of formerly low-income neighborhoods into fancier neighborhoods and new development. And the concern there is of local residents that feel like they're displaced and priced out of the local area. So gentrification, housing affordability has led New York City to develop policies like inclusionary zoning, where they require every new development to set aside a certain number of units for affordable housing. And it's also led to a review of their land use processes. The land use process is quite amazing in that it requires multiple layers of political sign-off to get a zoning change through, from the local planning board to the borough president, right up to the city council. And it often seems to come down to a thumbs up or thumbs down from the local city council member that gets to decide whether or not a zoning plan change will happen. And in return, that council member gets to negotiate various different benefits for their neighborhood through investment in local services and so on. So it's a multi-layered political process of getting development plan changes through. But the last picture I've got up there after the gentrification one is this pamphlet I picked up at one of the hearings I went to, talking about the lies of city planners. And in the middle of this urban growth period in New York, the planning department's under incredible pressure. And there's just a lot of tension between proponents of development, those that oppose it, concerns about gentrification, arguments made about displacement. And really it's the role of these land use processes to manage those tensions and make sure everybody feels included and reach a reasonable compromise. And it's amazing to see it happen, and the system could certainly be better, but that's at the heart of it really is the system of managing conflict. And that's obviously a very important role for urban planning. I don't want to go too long. I'll skip to the next one. This is a rapid fire run through urban planning issues. So the next insight is what's called social infrastructure. And perhaps the best place to start with this is the work of Eric Klinenberg, who's an interesting sociologist. And his original work was actually about Chicago in the 1990s and a heat wave, and how different types of neighborhoods experienced the heat wave differently. And over 700 people died, and most of the people were in poor neighborhoods, but some types of poor neighborhoods managed to respond to the heat wave better than others. And what it came down to, in his view, was the community ties between residents in those areas. So if you were more likely to knock on the door of a neighbor, you were more likely to they were more likely to survive the heat wave. So his idea is that all our infrastructure needs to be built in ways that encourage community ties And more recently, Clinenberg's been working on climate change adaptation. And I've got a couple of photos there, and one is of the New York Public Library, and then the other is of a library actually in Hokitika that was built with money from Andrew Carnegie. And Carnegie was giving money for what he called palaces of the people. And all these libraries that he funded around the world had to be free. And you wouldn't normally think of a public library as a response to climate change. But in Clinenberg's view, this is actually what we need. Climate change adaptation is as much about community resilience and community ties, and the sorts of institutions we need to build are things like libraries that allow people to get to know each other, that have people from different parts of the community coming together in a single shared space, that are free and accessible, and so on. So I thought that was an interesting insight, that infrastructure needs to be social infrastructure if we're going to have resilience for climate change. The final slide I've got here is really about technology. So I spent some time meeting with startup companies when I was in New York, and there's just a huge sector developing around real estate technology and urban planning technology that's yet to really come to New Zealand, but I think is going to change things. And one of the people I met with is a New Zealander at a company called Sidewalk Labs, and they're a Google subsidiary. And he told me the story of how they were started, which is quite amusing. Which is Larry Page is from Google is riding a bike around Silicon Valley, and he arrives at the traffic lights, and there's nothing coming. And so he sort of realizes how inefficient some of our urban systems really are, and how they might be improved by data, sensors, cell phones, and the like, and just how miles behind the planning world really is in any of that area. And so he sets up Sidewalk Labs. It's a company set up to promote new technology in urban life, and they've done some interesting stuff. So they've been trying to get a development done in Toronto, which is basically about Ross. Am I reaching my time limit? Am I? Oh, perhaps not. Sorry.
I was muted.
They've been working on a development in Toronto, which they've actually just had to cancel because the local residents have again opposed the idea that they might have a neighborhood full of sensors and data collection. But the interesting thing that they were doing in the neighborhood is they proposed to have modular streets, so that streets would actually be able to get bigger and smaller based on the traffic flow at that time of day. And they would have a way of changing the color of the concrete paving stones to map onto the traffic flows, and then they would use the streets for something else. And so that's just one example of this new technology, but others include new ways of pricing and managing curb space, which is where all the Amazon deliveries are all showing up rapidly and causing competition for parking space. And there's all sorts of new technology going into how you can more efficiently manage curb space, and that's seen to be a major possible source of revenue for local government. Other ideas include this one I've got on the slide here, GeoPipe, which is basically produced what they call a digital twin of of a number of cities in the United States, and they have ambitions to expand that across the world. So that basically means that anybody will be able to download a digital twin of their city. So it's going to be an enormous time saving for architecture, but also useful for other purposes. So I think the upshot of this really for reform of New Zealand's regulatory settings is that we need to be able to accommodate these changes. And I think how might you do that? I think the way that regulation needs to respond really is to provide a simple, clear, and enabling environment for some of this stuff to happen, and that it certainly speaks to, having something that's everybody can easily understand what they can and can't do, so that some of these ideas can come forward. I think I've pretty much got to the end of my 20 minutes, and I feel like I've only scraped the surface of a few experiences that I've had, but I'm happy to share my research paper with you, and we've got a current review of the Resource Management Act underway, and it's got a report coming out very shortly where some of these ideas and more will be found.
Thank you very much, Joe. I think it might be useful. We can talk later about putting your research paper up on the Harkness website, the New Zealand Harkness Trust website. And so we can see, and you'll be able to download it and read it. And we'll send broadcast information out, of course, on the Fulbright New Zealand network as well. So we now move to hear from Donna Provost. Donna is currently Director of Strategy at the Office of the Children's Commissioner here in Wellington. In the latter part of last year, so I think it was September onwards, she travelled to the United States and was hosted first by the Center for the Developing Child at Harvard University, and then later at the University of Oregon's Center for Translational Neuroscience. And her task, or what she wanted to do, was to explore approaches to improving child well-being, particularly relating to their sense of belonging, identity, belonging and identity. So I'm going to turn over to Donna now, and we'll look forward to hearing from what you have to say and what you found, Donna.
So, tēnā koutou katoa, and thank you, Ross, for that introduction. I'm going to share a little bit about my Harkness Fellowship that focused on supporting children and young people to live their best lives. And I'm going to share where I went, what I learned, and some key insights that we can build on. So first of all, it's about the topic. Here in New Zealand, we have a lot of big issues for children and young people about poverty, health, abuse, education, youth suicide, etc. But whenever we ask kids what would make the biggest difference in their lives for them, they talk about belonging, identity, inclusion, relationships, how important these friends and family and being accepted are to them. So when I went off to do my Harkness Fellowship, that's what I wanted to look at what policy options and approaches there are so that children and young people have that strong sense of belonging, identity, and agency. And about the same time I was starting my fellowship was the release of the Child and Youth Wellbeing Strategy that was developed by the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet. Now, this is a great strategy. It's a holistic and aspirational, and it describes, as you see on the screen, 6 different outcome areas that we would like to see for children and young people. So children and young people are loved, safe, and nurtured. They have what they need. They're happy and healthy. They're learning and developing. They're accepted, respected, and connected, and involved, empowered. Now, for the most part, the first 4 of those we know a lot about, and we understand what things have to change. But we don't always look at the last 2, the accepted, respected, connected, involved, empowered is the same. We treat them as nice to haves rather than on the same footing. And that's what I really wanted to look at and understand. And remember, these are the things that children shared with us and say are the most important. And in fact, when we were supporting the development of the strategy, we did engagement with over 6,000 children and young people that supported having their voice heard and those exact factors to incorporate into the strategy. So really pleased with that. Now, if we look at those quickly a little deeper, when you say children and young people are accepted, respected, connected, what is that? Well, they feel manakitanga, kindness and respect and care for others. They feel accepted, respected, and valued at home, school, community, online. They're living free from racism, discrimination. They have stable, healthy relationships connected to their culture, etc. Involved and empowered is that they're having their voices and perspectives and opinions listened to and taken into account. They're supported to exercise increasing autonomy as they age and take on more responsibilities. And in this way, agency isn't just about an individual agency, but it's how they develop collective agency. Now, if we reflect back on our experience around COVID-19, all of us had a sense of feeling about how debilitating it was to be deprived of the connections for our families, our friends, our wider circle of acquaintances, how important those social interactions were, and also how it felt to be powerless and without control over basic decisions about where we went, who we saw, what we could do or not. We were told, stay at home, stay in your neighborhoods, etc. And so when you think about how that affected us and how important it is to have those sense of connections, and also with Black Lives Matters, how that has also come over top and said that the value of being respected, accepted, and living free of racism, how important these things are actually to our lives. So this was the basis that I went on, and that means that these aren't just nice to haves, these are need to haves, and they need to be treated on the same level as our other elements of well-being. So it was on this basis that I went off to the US and had a lot of conversations to say, right, what's the role of government and how can we do a better job of that for our kids in New Zealand? So first of all, where did I go? Well, I did things a little differently. I didn't just go to one location. I went over the 3 months to multiple locations and spoke to over 150 people across the US, across 5 states. Started in Boston, where I was hosted the Center on the Developing Child, had a trip to New York as a sidebar on that as well. And Harvard was just truly amazing. It was a great opportunity to meet with some of the people that are really at the leading edge of the research and communications regarding best approaches to child development, particularly in the early years. And also to meet with some real experts in topics like youth suicide, impact of ethnicity and race on development, protective factors, psychology, role of education. So amazing opportunity to meet with some real experts. This picture here, you see one of the selfies is me with Jack Shonkoff, who's a bit of a rock star in the early child development space. Next, I went to the West Coast, and on the West Coast, I was hosted by the University of Oregon in Eugene, Center of Translational Neuroscience, but I also went and visited Seattle in Washington State, as well as Corvallis in Eugene, and went down to Palo Alto in California. Now, I did something a little different there, where I met with a lot of people who were practicing and implementing these policies with community organizations, researchers, state officials, all working together to test and research ideas, and had really practical on the ground experiences. And in many ways, Oregon and Washington State are really much better comparators of many of the other American states about what we can learn from New Zealand to take away from those. So yes, it was a fabulous experience across the West Coast of traveling through those states, and also you can see me in the little RV taking full advantage of the Americana experience there. So what did I learn? It was a fantastic trip and got to meet lots of people, but what am I taking out of it and how does it apply to New Zealand? Well, I say I learned both a lot and not much. A lot in that the many conversations, the detailed areas of expertise, examples of good practice, the intervention, research, intervention and design, and the on-the-ground practice all provided really important threads that I can weave together into a tapestry to say, what is it that we want to provide for children and young people here, and how can that support it? But also not much, in that it became very clear that the overall approach we're taking here in Aotearoa is actually very sound. It's an aspirational and holistic child and youth well-being strategy. We have a growing focus on listening to children and young people, and that's a great thing. And we're also beginning to tackle issues around racism and discrimination, particularly for Tamariki Māori. So, you know, there's a lot of good in what we're doing here, and I also had the opportunity to share that with people across the US. And I have to say, it's good to be out of the fishbowl here and have that perspective, because they really reflected how fabulous our approach about well-being and listening to children was in advance to many of the things that they're doing, and what a great start we're doing on that. So I'm going to share just 3 kind of insights that wrap all my discussions and talks together and say, what did I pull out of that? And the first one is, I don't believe that we fully understand or embrace the importance of the first 1,000 days in a children's life on childhood and adult well-being. And I say that because I think health in the early years lay the groundwork for a lifetime of outcomes. And science has conclusively tracked that the high rates of chronic disease in adults, from diabetes, hypertension, cardiovascular disease, various types of cancer, depression, anxiety disorders, addiction, other mental health issues, all can be tracked to issues in the early years, and they all have their markers in the early issues suffered in those early years. So adverse events or experiences in those first 1,000 days have consequences for well-being immediately and throughout to adulthood. There was an important study released just a couple weeks ago here in New Zealand from the Growing Up in New Zealand study that linked the extra hour of sleep that an infant had on obesity, both in childhood and towards adulthood. So we have our own evidence that supports this here too, but overall, we haven't redirected the resources and support in our health promotion and prevention to have a focus on the first 1,000 days. So I think that that's a real key in unlocking some of the challenges we face, not only in our health, but also the cost drivers in our health systems. The answers aren't going to come from developing adult obesity strategies or setting up new cancer centers. They're going to come from us really looking at and supporting the early years different. And those circumstances in the early years have a much greater impact on the adult life health than the things like our lifestyle choices around diet, alcohol, drugs, exercise, and stress levels, etc. That we often said that's what we can change, but we need to focus on early years. So second insight is that social sector research and science are progressing rapidly, and this is providing us with many new tools to design and evaluate services to make sure they're having impact. Now, when you think of this, it's around looking at not just what works, but what works for whom, in what circumstances, what conditions, why does it not work for some groups, what are the key elements that really bring about change, and how do we just focus on those? So really refining our understanding of the tools in the social science. And things have changed a lot, and we need to embrace that innovation and change. Now, I had a laptop computer in the early 90s that was one of the first versions out from Apple computers, and I thought it was great, but it would challenge Air New Zealand's carrying on luggage now, and it barely churned through word processing. We accept that the technology's changed, and now I have a laptop that slides into my handbag, outperforms everything, and I would never for a minute imagine going back and just using my laptop from 1992. But that is exactly what we're doing in some of our social sector supports programs and research. We're using 30-year-old thinking. So and maybe that's because it takes so much effort and time for us to actually get the funding and support for things that we're scared to let go of it. But we need to embrace a much more innovative attitude to be able to say, that was great then, what else could we do? What else could we learn? How do we improve this to make sure it works for the right audiences? And we're doing everything that we can to support children and young people with the knowledge we have now. The third area that I want to talk to just briefly was around, this is the main area, belonging, identity, and agency that I looked at. And one is that they can be built and strengthened. These are not things that we just have to wring our hands about and say, oh, some people have them, some are more resilient. That's simply not true. And there's protective factors around there that we can build and support so that children have a strengthened sense of belonging, identity, and agency. And this will have significant flow-on effects for all of their well-being. And how, you might ask? Well, here's something I prepared earlier. To enhance belonging, identity, and agency for children and young people, we need to better understand and grow protective factors through responsive relationships, supportive communities, increasing sense of agency, and the identity and belonging that's often backed by faith and cultural traditions. And then we need to shift our thinking from fixing problems to actually chasing what good looks like. So building manakitangi, the care, respect, and kindness for others, inclusion, hope, empowerment, participation, katiakitangi. These are all things that we can actually break down the steps for and say, and how do we support these in children and young people? And how do we build them into the other programs and services that we're delivering, whether it's universal programs in a school setting or specific programs and supports to help children when they have challenges, building these factors into them. So, you know, when we measure the positives and we look towards progressing towards the positives rather than when we look towards just fixing a problem, we get a whole other set of outcomes that are much broader than the issue itself. And so this is the idea of chasing good that I really have brought back, and we're focusing in on our work. And if we do this, I think we'll be going some ways towards, you know, supporting children and young people to live their best lives, as I spoke on the first slide. And so I want to close this now with just a quote that when a flower doesn't bloom, you fix the environment it grows, not the flower itself. And I believe, like that flower, all children and young people have the potential to blossom and thrive when we provide them with the right environment and nurture and support them. So kia ora, and thank you very much for your time today.
So Doug, let me just briefly introduce. Doug, when he was on the fellowship, Doug was at that point in Manahotu, which is the General Manager of Maori at the Environmental Protection Authority. And he's since, and most recently, left the Environmental Protection Authority, and he's become the Chief Executive of his own iwi, Nai Tamanahiri, and he's now living and based in Gisborne. So, and Doug went away with a very interesting task, which was to explore the issues and the costs that need to be considered when introducing new technologies such as gene editing to protect native species, and the sort of trade-offs and the discussions that are going to be required to bring community support together and community understanding. So Doug, we look forward to hearing from you for a few minutes, and we'll certainly come back to Donna when we can get her back again.
Cool. Kia ora everybody. I'll just share my presentation. Cool. Can you all see that?
Not yet.
No.
Okay, hang on, there's something going on here.
It's not unusual to have a large delay.
Okay, I'll try that again. Oh, here we go. That's better. Cool, how's that?
Yeah, perfect.
All right, kia ora everybody. Nei la te mihi kia tātou katoa I tēnei ahiahi. He wā whakahirahira tēnei, te tuku kōrero kia koutou katoa. So this is a great opportunity for me to report back to you all on what it was an amazing adventure for my family and I, and just want to firstly thank the Harkness Fellowship Trust for giving us this opportunity, which has really opened my eyes and hopefully allows us to sort of share some thinking moving forward. So the question that I went over to answer or to start investigating was, how do we have a mature conversation about environmental trade-offs in Aotearoa, New Zealand? And to really put it to the heart of things, we have a very passionate community, and there's a passionate voice out there around 1080 and its use or non-use. And we also have a community that is really pro, I suppose, GMO and gene editing And I suppose for me in the EPA, we were stuck in a position around regulating both of these things. So I suppose this conversation is really targeted at policymakers and regulators across the environmental sector. But I suppose the context that we're looking at is that the EPA has responsibilities under the Hazardous Substances and New Organisms Act to administer and manage approvals around the use of 1080 and other chemicals, as well as genetic modification and gene editing. So they're all under the same regime. And this, I suppose, comes into conflict. These particular aspects come into conflict amongst New Zealand communities in trying to manage and protect our environment. And when you add in the treaty or Te Tiriti or Waitangi into this mix, it becomes a very complicated issue. Something else, I suppose, is in terms of context was Dave Hansford wrote a book called Protecting Paradise, and he pointed to research from Manaaki Whenua that did some modelling within New Zealand around the impact of introduced species, and I suppose the one line of that came out of it was that 26.7 million of New Zealand's native bird eggs and chicks are being killed by introduced pests every year. So I think that's a pretty significant number for us in a small country. The other thing that was going on is that a guy by the name of Professor Kevin Esvelt was visiting New Zealand and had made contact with me and a number of people across New Zealand around some of his work in sculpting evolution. And in particular, he had a project over in Massachusetts and in the offshore islands, Nantucket and Martha's Vineyard, called Mice Against Ticks. And so I was really interested in seeing what this was all about. So basically, to try and inform my question, I looked at a number of criteria to try and break up what does a mature conversation look like. And I suppose my assumption was that a well-informed public leads to trust and confidence, whether it's in the conversations, whether it's in the different roles that people have, that a well-informed public would be respectful, and that this would lead to less outrage and science denial in the community. So that was the assumption that I went over there with. So why MIT? I looked at a whole bunch of things, but really was to spend some time with Kevin Esvelt. But in amongst that, I looked at a number of these issues that I'll touch on pretty soon. So in terms of Kevin Esvelt and his group Sculpting Evolution, it was based in the MIT Media Lab, which has, I suppose, a briefing that says to look at things outside the square. That's the basic briefing of the MIT Media Lab. Sculpting Evolution are primarily focused on biotechnology and gene editing to support the world's most significant problems. So they're looking at mosquitoes that are transmitting malaria, and also tick-borne diseases such as Lyme within New England and the US. The interesting thing about Kevin Esvelt is that he was one of the co-creators of the technology CRISPR-Cas9, or otherwise known as gene drive. And so this was quite an interesting conversation. He and his colleagues promoted the idea that gene drive could support conservation efforts in eradicating unwanted pests. However, that sort of grew legs, and over time he's changed his view quite a bit. And that's because in trying to solve one problem, he's realized he's created another problem. And so, for example, if we were to introduce gene drive into possums, it would be great for us here in New Zealand. However, if it was to get out across Australia, that would be a bad thing for the Australians, and I suppose the native people of Australia. So The other issue that he was grappling with is that humans can't help themselves. So when issues such as calicivirus and those sorts of examples are where we're trying to get rid of one problem and create another. So he's trying to avoid that. So instead, he's created a new story. He's created a new approach where he's saying, look, I'm admitting my faults, I was wrong. However, here's another approach. And he's wanting to fix it by introducing other technologies. However, the main philosophy was to engage with the communities first, to co-design and co-govern technology before it's developed. That's the main philosophy of his group. This philosophy is what attracted me to him and his program, and the community engagement and decision-making aspects of their approach. So getting to the, I suppose, the nub of the question was another one, which is gene editing ethical? And that's a pretty big question to ask. However, I suppose what I thought about was to make a decision whether it is ethical or not, or whether it's the right thing for New Zealand or not, is what do you need? And so I used this sort of framework around informed consent. So we need to have informed consent to make a decision. If you have informed consent, it means you've had a choice. That choice is usually informed by moral values, and those moral values are usually, well, are heavily influenced by the culture and the culture in which you've been brought up in. And also that culture is defined and transformed by the language that you use. And so the language that you use also either helps or hinders whether you provide consent or not. So in that sort of approach, I started breaking that down. And so I'll quickly go through a few things, but ultimately we looked at rights, and to give consent, you must have a right, whether it's as an individual or as a community, whether you're mandated to make a decision, but it's best to be informed. When looking at rights, I looked at this idea of paternalism, and what attracted me was some of the work in the sort of 1800s and some of the behaviours of people, which was to trust the doctor, they know best. And if you extrapolate that into where we are today, that type of behaviour has carried on. So the idea here is that we're putting trust into someone or something of a higher authority, or what we deem to be a higher authority. So a couple of examples when starting to unpick this, and also trying to understand what outrage and science denial in this mix looks like. So for example, for you doctors that are out there, or for those that have been prescribed drugs, there might be a figure that says, look, 95% of the population will react positively to this drug. And then to extrapolate that again, in the technical, or in the IT world, TripAdvisor. TripAdvisor is really about people rating a restaurant or a hotel that they've stayed at. And so we put our trust into TripAdvisor because people are giving it 5 stars instead of 3 stars. This then can be extrapolated to say, well, my friend on Facebook, they know about this stuff around gene editing, so their view, I hold their view higher up. And then the last one is, let's ask Google. Just checking that we're all okay. Can you still hear me? Thumbs up. Cool. All right, Ross, you were frozen, that's all. Cool. So I also looked at this idea of epistemic closure, which in a nutshell means when a group of people believe, or what they believe has narrowed down to what they hear, and then pretty much they advocate for the position that suits their view. So if it doesn't suit their view, then it can't be true. And so how do we unpick that? And really where you're getting to is that I've got a framework and was given a framework to sort of unpick that, but ultimately it was really to say, when you form a view, you're really stuck in that view. you know, it's really hard to shift people. So I looked at, well, how would we shift it? You know, once they form a view and they become stuck, how would you shift it? So to run through it quickly, lower societal oxytocin was this idea of mistrust and group mistrust, and that was formed through habits through the caveman days. You know, we don't want to get kicked out of the cave, so we're always looking over our shoulder to make sure that our mate next door is not trying to get one over us. So that is I suppose is our default behavior. How we start to change that is this idea of neuroplasticity, which, to summarize it, really means we are able to change behaviors, we are able to change the way that we're thinking. And so the saying that you're never too old to learn new tricks rings true. So taking that sort of approach, how do you then change one person's behavior? And what I came to learn is that a person's sense of belonging is the most powerful human behavior. And so the little quote there, "You don't just play, you belong," is actually the motto for my rugby club in Wellington. And so, you know, for Pōneke, I thought, well, that really rings true, because, yep, you play rugby, but you end up being part of this rugby club and that community until you die. And it's much the same with any other clubs that you join or any other social gatherings that you're part of. So how do we change it? Well, we start focusing on the narrative and the story and the culture that sits behind that club or that group, and that informs our behaviour. So to summarise that, in order to overcome lower societal oxytocin, storytelling is the best way, because it's about retaining culture, it's about changing culture and behaviour and influencing. I started looking at negotiation because part of the question that I had was around trade-offs. And so a trade-off is a form of negotiation. And so the first thing that you look at when you're negotiating, and one of the things that I found was the types of language and how you frame your argument. There's also this idea of anchoring. So when you are in the heat of a negotiation, you need to sort of have someone to go talk to and say, am I thinking straight, or am I caught up in the moment of negotiation? Also, when negotiating, you know, whether it's a used car, you know, you always say to the car salesman, oh, that car's worth $12,000. The guy down the road's $10,000. I may as well go down there. And you try to create value, or claim value, I should say, rather than trying to create a win-win situation. So when thinking about the question, what are our alternatives to gene editing, 1080, or trapping and hunting? So it's a question that we need to start forming in our minds. And I think the answer there is that it's not, we can't do it all. You know, gene editing isn't the silver bullet, 1080 isn't the silver bullet, trapping and hunting isn't the silver bullet. So I'm just going to open up the chat. Sorry, cool. But the main thing that I learned from the negotiation work was that we need to stay in the conversation. We need to be willing to share and to create the best value for all involved. So stay in the conversation. Just because it's hard, don't go to an alternative. Let's see if this is leadership. So I looked at leadership, this idea of the high fruits model is something that's been used particularly around conflict management in the US. And I think there's quite a big piece there around what leadership looks like, and I'll touch on that at the end. Observability is just something that promotes positive behavior. So if you use Facebook, for example, and you were to click on something, vote for something, that would show up on your Facebook profile as a good thing. Another example of that is the press-up challenge that's happening at the moment. Someone does their press-ups and then nominates somebody else. They feel guilty because somebody else is doing a good deed, so they start doing a good deed as well. So what? So I suppose what I've come to is that the power of storytelling, we need a story of now. We need a story of what that's going to look like for this space around managing our native species. I started thinking about what does that story look like for Aotearoa New Zealand, and I started thinking of Maui. Maui, the demigod. We have a haka up here in Gisborne that says Maui is a god, Maui is a man, Maui is a bird, and Maui is a lizard. So the idea and the concept of, I suppose, transgenics or shapeshifting and genetics isn't a new idea. Collaborative decision making. If we look at what Kevin Esfeld has done, he's promoting this idea of shared decision making, community-driven decision making. He started a conversation where people are prepared to stay in the conversation. They are willing to share and be vulnerable. And I think he's also engaged with passionate people like we have here, whether it's 1080, whether it's GMO or gene editing. People are passionate about their views. So why not harness that to create action? And I suppose in terms of next steps, apart from needing to have a conversation about this, we need to revisit the HASNO Act because it doesn't enable this sort of approach. We need ministers to enable this conversation. And so those of you in decision-making power that are online tonight, I would urge you to encourage ministers to start having this conversation, but to empower communities, iwi, NGOs and stakeholders in this conversation to lead it rather than from the top down. It's a bottom-up approach. So that's a really short summary of our time, and thank you.
Doug, thank you very much indeed. That's very, very interesting, and I'm sure it's going to promote more conversation as well. So thank you very much.